Welcome to my fourth video where we're making asteroids in GameMaker. And in this video, we're going to kind of clean up my movement controls uh, and expand it so that you can have multiple keys to handle turning in a very clean and efficient manner. Rather than having a billion events here on the player, we can just handle all this inside of step. So where we left off, we had just finished putting a background in and giving the player some kind of particles when the ship moves around. And we got our screen wrapping and we chased the mouse. If we push the P key, it's now using the keyboard. So let's try to kind of clean a lot of this up and then enable the usage of things like WASD. And also, by extension, you could see how custom controls could be done. So the step event is where we want to handle most of my movement-related stuff. So we could start by recording all of the movement presses. So we'll do that right after this. So we'll do it after we've toggled the steering. So we're going to have read movement keys. And what we're going to do here is create variables for each of the directions. So the left. So if we're pressing a left key, we'll use keyboard _ check. And this activates, like I set up here, every frame the key is down. So if we want to check for the left key, that's VK for virtual keyboard, left. Or, so those two vertical bars for or, keyboard _ check, ord A. So that would be letting us use A in a WASD sense. And so because we're using or, we're no longer going to have, if we had multiple events, we're not going to be able to turn twice as fast, because if you're pushing the left key and the A key simultaneously, left is just going to be true. And so we'll do the same thing for right. We'll create a variable here for right. And we'll just do VK right and use the D key. Then we're going to do up and down. So a variable for up, a variable for down, and VK up with the corresponding WASD command of W, and VK down with the corresponding key of S. So those variables are going to track if we are pressing what we consider to be a left action, a right action, up action, or a down action. Those are going to be either true or false based on if the user is pressing that. So there's a few things we can do to make our life a little bit easier. So what I'm going to do is create a variable for the horizontal input of the player. Now, in this specific case, left is actually a positive action, because like if we look here, if I'm pressing left, I'm adding the degrees. In most things, like if you're doing like a twin stick shooter, left tends to be a negative thing. So I'm going to do right minus left, which is an interesting bit of data type, like kind of implicit casting. These are Booleans. And so if left is true, but right is not, so if left is true, left would equal 1. If right is false, right would equal 0. So when I put them in a math operation like this, it'll be 0 minus 1, and then the horizontal input would be -1, which actually I think I want the other way around. I want left minus right, because if I'm pushing left, I want a positive result. And if I'm pushing right, I want a negative result. For vertical input, we'll do up minus down. So if you're pushing both up and down simultaneously, it's going to be equal to 0, because 1 minus 1 is 0. If you're just pushing down alone, you'd get -1. So this is a way for me to convert the key presses into a number. So left will equal -1, right would equal, I'm sorry, that's backwards. Left is +1, right is -1. If I'm pushing up, I get +1. If I'm pushing down, I get -1. So that's going to help us do some of the logic here. So let's kind of piggyback off this if statement for using mouse steering. Because with my left and right commands, if mouse steering is false, well, that's just the else case of this. So what I could do is take this code, jump over here, add an else, and this would be the code for if mouse steering is false. And so we could just put that there. And then we can multiply this by my h input, my horizontal input variable up there. So h input will be +1 if I'm pushing left, and -1 if I'm pushing right. So what that'll do is that'll just make this value negative if I'm pushing right and positive if I'm pushing left. So I don't have to have two separate if statements to handle that input. I mean, you could just have if left add turn speed, if right subtract turn speed. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. But I do think this is a slightly easier way to handle that. So now I can take the very brave step of actually deleting this because I don't want to double trigger it. So I'm going to delete this. I'm just going to go down to delete event. And I'm going to take out right as well. Now, to be fair, you can Control Z that if you accidentally delete the wrong one. All right, so we've got this code here where I'm using this horizontal variable to handle it. I no longer have that as an event for my keyboard. So let's make sure it works before we continue. So here's my game. So I've got my mouse movement active right now. So if I push the P key, that'll disable it. And now I can use the A and D for rotation. And I can use the arrow keys for the rotation. And if I push them at the same time, I don't get anything crazy. But if I push like D and left, I get nothing because they're canceling each other out. So now I just need to do that for W and S, and now I'll have WASD controls for my ship. So that's going to be a little bit more tricky bringing this code in. But we can kind of see some similarities. So if it's negative, we're going to be multiplying by half. And so we could actually keep these speed bounds. I mean, to be fair, we could probably use the clamp thing. But let's try to construct that. So we're inside of our step event now. Let's update the description. This is now steering and movement. So we'll do that right here, right before we handle our turning. So I'll start by taking the keyboard up stuff, and honestly, I'm just going to copy and paste it. Then we can put it right here. We will want to do, let's see, if v input is not equal to 0. So that means we're pushing something. We're pushing either forward or backwards, but not both. So we're moving all this code inside of this if statement. Now let's go take the other speed here. Well, I guess I could probably just wrap that in one command. So like this is the command, but I could probably just nest that. Or I could just use both commands simultaneously. We can multiply this by v input. The only problem that this is going to cause is it's not going to give me that half motion for going backwards. So I'll have to think about that. And then the Spark code will be done right here. If v input is greater than 0, we can actually spawn the sparks. So basically, if you're actually pushing forward. Now we might need a few comments here. And for spawn sparks, and if v input greater than 0, so this did get a little bit more complex of code here. So, but it's going to ultimately reduce the amount of things that we're going to need here, because now I don't need this event. I don't need this event. So now I'm handling all of my movement inside of here. And so now I can push forward. Now backwards doesn't emit sparks, so we could always think about how we want to adjust that. And so all of my keyboard stuff is handled inside of the step event, and it is no longer part of the all these other events over here. So let's kind of fix some of this with this v input. So there's a couple different things we could approach. Here, when we're subtracting these, we could recompute this and just make this half effect. So the reason I would do it this way is that way if I'm pushing up and down at the same time, they still cancel their inputs out in terms of getting into this if statement. But here we will then reappropriately adjust down to being only half magnitude. So when v input gets computed, if I'm pushing down, I'll only get half of my acceleration. And so that should work out pretty well. And the Spark code here looks good. As far as the colors, we could try to add one for negative versions. We could have it spit out a red spark going in the forward direction. So we could add an else right here. And we don't have to get crazy and use a whole for loop. Oops. Right here. So we could have an else right here and just spawn a spark. So this one, since I'm going backwards, I don't need the plus 180. The speed could be fine. And I don't really want to randomly generate the hue, so I might just use a red spark. I'll just use one of the default commands for red. So that if I'm going in reverse, then I get this. That way the player gets a little bit of feedback if they're going in reverse. So going forward, we get that spark, and in reverse, we get some red sparks. All right, and so this, while this does seem like a little bit more code inside of the step method, it does make my events a little bit cleaner, And it allows me the very easy ability to kind of adjust what keys are doing what. And so this is kind of a preferred way to actually set up movement. I know it is kind of long, and so if you are missing any code, you can pause the video here. I'll scroll down in a second to get some more of it. So this is from lines 1 to 40. And then from lines 40 to about 80. And then the remainder of it. So you can pause the video if you're missing any of those pieces. But now we only have the 3 events. So we've only got our begin step where we're just applying the friction. This step will overwrite friction. Friction will then get, friction happens in between step and end step. And then our end step, we're going to screen wrap. The end step will eventually expand as we start having cooldowns, getting unstuck, destroying the ship and such. So that one will definitely grow over time. But it makes it easier to kind of navigate, and it's now all code. So that does wrap this up. And then the next set, we're going to start kind of what I would consider the second series of this videos, where we're going to look at adding weapons for the player. So being able to attack, spawning lasers, how to have multiple weapons, adding an energy bar to limit the amount of attacks you can do. And so that'll be an interesting endeavor in adding some more stuff to the player. So thank you for watching, and let's move on to being able to create some lasers.